I like your witty monologue, Rory. It was good.
Tell a joke, Rory.
Oh man.
I know it's a lot of pressure.
It's a perfect spot to start your joke is when the stream's live. That way, anyone who joins now will get to hear your joke at the beginning.
My kids' favorite, although they still, I don't know, and maybe now they get it. When my kids were younger, they didn't get it, but they love to tell it. It's what do you get when you cross a skunk with a shy owl? Something that stinks but doesn't give a hoot. And then they go, why is that funny?
Rabbi Rose, you're muted. Perhaps thankfully.
Oh, I've said it sounds like my teenage boys.
Okay, some of you appreciated that joke more than others, and as all of our participants suddenly leave the room.
Don't exaggerate. You got one comment, Rory. I wouldn't say that qualifies as
We got two.
Okay,
comments,
you're right.
One in favor and one against. So we're evenly matched here. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to be with all of you again, even with humor and without humor. So a quick word of welcome. Hopefully all of you know all of us already, but I am Rory Picker-Nice. I work as the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and I'm joined by, just going in the order of my screen, not in the order that I like you, but you can take it as you want. So Rabbi Jim Bennett from Congregation Sher Emeth, Rabbi Daniel Bogard from Central Reform Congregation, and Rabbi Carney Rose from Congregation B'nai Emunah. And I always have a little bit of panic that in the midst of saying this, I'm going to forget it. Luckily, your names are all right here. So we're really thrilled to continue this conversation. As many of you know, we come together as 4 rabbis who have studied together through the Hartman Institute, and just want to talk about some of the significant issues that are facing our community, facing our world, and that we continue to wrestle with. So we've been sort of on this theme that actually Rabbi Rose introduced us to. And so a few months ago, we each brought texts to talk about our understanding or perception of God. We started with God, we started with Torah. Now I can't remember the order we did. You're muted, I don't know which. Okay, we did God, we did Torah. For me, we probably could have brought the same text for the other one also, right? We deeply intertwined with one another. And so we were thinking about doing, it was God, Torah, and Israel. And so we wanted to talk about Israel today, and we thought we would shake it up a little bit. And instead of each of us bringing texts from sources that we all wanted to bring, we actually thought we would share a video text that we're all gonna then kind of study together. So I'm going to share in just a minute a 14-minute clip, and it's a conversation between 2 of our teachers through the Hartman program, Yessi Klein Halevi and Yehuda Kurtzer. So many of you are probably familiar with them. Yessi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's a well-known author. He's written books including Like Dreamers, which won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. And his most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. And also together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he has founded and co-directs at the Shalom Hartman Institute, the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel, which is a fascinating project we could spend a whole bunch of time on just itself. And Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He's a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, on Jewish history and Jewish memory, and on questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. This is a much longer clip. Unfortunately, we had to kind of chop it down a bit so that we all had time to actually respond to it. So we're going to be jumping into the middle of the conversation and cutting off a little bit early. But with that, I invite you to, we'll watch this clip. You feel free to put some of the reflections into the chat. You can reflect live as you listen to them also, and then we'll all join together afterwards. So
Maharat Rory, just if I could add just one piece. First, these are ongoing conversations that are happening amongst the faculty of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And I think it's very important for us to mention that, and maybe we can somehow send it out to the audience at large, because I think many of us take time in our busy rabbinic schedules to listen to these podcasts, these discussions. And I think it's really worthwhile. And I hope that interested people who would like to access these conversations. It would be worthwhile for them to access. And the last thing I wanted to say is we decided today not to have text per se, but the video becomes the text, just to remind us of a great teaching of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, that in the end, what we need in this day and age are text people. Text people. And I think these two individuals are, for us, text people. They exemplify much of what it is that we're trying to achieve, not only in terms of the content, but in the way in which they dialogue respectfully with one another. And they've been wonderful role models for us as we continue to try to have this wonderful dialogue amongst the four of us and beyond. So I hope you don't mind my little fataich there, Maharat Roy, but I think it's really an important piece, at least for me, as I was watching this last night, and again, looking forward to watching it with you all today.
Thank you. Thank you for adding all of that. I love that. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. You'll all tell me if anything goes wrong, and enjoy.
What are your parameters for defining threat, defining credible threat, and how do we deal with it?
So part of why I sit where I sit and what I'm anxious about in the resurgence of anti-Semitism is, and I know this is a loaded phrase, I feel like there's an industry around anti-Semitism that is constantly monitoring it, fixating on it, in weird ways actually amplifying it. Deborah Lipstadt talks about this in her new book on anti-Semitism, where she says we have to figure out how to fight anti-Semitism without amplifying it. But I find that so much of the current conversation about anti-Semitism actually just gives it a bigger platform and gives it more noise. I think social media has done this in a really destructive way. I think there has to be a way that we obviously have to be vigilant in our communities around security. We have to not falsify the fears of Israelis when they talk about their existential threat. But I'm still on the other side, and I know you're pushing me towards how to name where this fear actually is and what it's about, but I just watch the way that it exhausts the totality of community discourse.
So let's look at BDS for a moment. I actually think that BDS is not a threat or a significant threat to Israel, but I do believe that it is a growing threat to the diaspora. My fear is that BDS will set back American Jewry by 2 generations, back to that point of acute American Jewish self-consciousness in the public space. The great victory of American Jewry in the last generation or two was overcoming Jewish self-consciousness. You didn't have to worry about, am I being too Jewish in public? Am I speaking with my hands? Am I saying anything inappropriate? It was in my generation that I saw the transition. And your generation grew up without that self-consciousness. BDS threatens to restore American Jews to that point where you will be asking yourself the question in certain public spaces, in progressive public spaces, is what I'm saying right now appropriate? Is this too Jewish? Is it Zionist? Is it going to mark me in some way as unacceptably other? Now, BDS is not really threatening the Israeli economy. In fact, there seems to be a direct proportion to the more BDS activity there is, the more the Israeli economy grows. But now I'm worried about you, I'm worried about American Jewry.
So if that's the case, Yossi, why is there so much noise about BDS from the Israeli government? In other words, do you think that they think that BDS is a genuine source of existential threat to the state of Israel? Do you think that BDS is fundamentally anti-Semitic? Because I can actually understand if somebody says, if you believe that this political movement is anti-Semitic, and part of the job of Jews in the world is to combat and defeat anti-Semitism, then you feel enlisted in it. But it's actually confusing to say this isn't really a threat to me. And on that, I agree with you. The data about the movement is actually quite weak. It's had very few real accomplishments. It has some symbolic accomplishments. But if that's the case, why do you think our community is so invested in fighting?
All right, so look, I think that the argument can be made that the real threat of BDS to Israel is not economic, but conceptual. BDS risks raising a generation of future leaders in the West who view the very word Zionism as illegitimate. And that could have strategic consequences for Israel down the line. So in that sense, I hear the argument that's made in Israeli government circles that we can't ignore this because this is a long-term thing. It's not an immediate threat. But I see this as an immediate threat to the diaspora. Now, if we had a healthier diaspora-Israel relationship, we would be having this conversation not only between the two of us, but within the Israeli government and between the Israeli government and Jewish organizations. That conversation isn't happening.
So here's what makes me cynical about the project of fighting BDS as it's coming from the Israeli government. I actually get why a government wants to fight delegitimization movements against its country anywhere. I don't discredit the government for trying to make that effort. But what I am fearful of is that there actually is very little space in the American Jewish community on the left, especially in the progressive left, as there is increasingly in Israel, to be a principled, outspoken critic of the government's policy without being tarred as being a self-hating Jew, an anti-Semite, or being anti-Israel. I think it's actually in the interest of a right-leaning government to keep that pressure up. And therefore, maintaining the noise around BDS as an effort forces American Jews constantly to make these choices. In that respect, actually, the fight against BDS and what you described as BDS itself are both conspiring to put American Jews in this impossible situation of constantly having to perform our loyalties and our responsibilities. Partly what I would love to see is less focus on this movement. I'm with you. I don't like non-nuanced mass movements that reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a morality play. I don't like it. I don't think there's been any credible moral claim that BDS has made that their position is more moral by any standing than even that which they're fighting against. I don't want it either. I want more space. I want to be able to say, here's where I stand in support of a decision of the Israeli government, and here's where I oppose it. That's the tool, that's the stuff of relationship. But as it's currently constructed, all we have is this option of either what I find to be an immoral and ineffective political movement to delegitimize Israel, and a totally ineffective and maybe even counterproductive effort to try to tamp down that movement.
Okay, but let's dig a little bit deeper. Is your assessment of BDS, does it go beyond dislike to something more acute? Do you sense that BDS might be constricting public spaces for American Jews?
I think that is absolutely the interest. I think that's the interest of almost any type of protest movement like that, is to try to get people to have to perform their loyalties one way or another, and BDS is not alone in that respect. But I think I want to parse a Talmudic distinction in BDS. There is what BDS represents as a political, in theory, nonviolent movement that seeks to protest the actions and maybe even the existence of the State of Israel. And then there are a whole set of individuals and sometimes organizations associated with the movement. On its face, a movement like BDS is not inherently anti-Semitic and not inherently problematic. Americans have a long and storied and wonderful history of boycott movements, including connected to the civil rights movement, that are not only not immoral, but they are actually tools of civil disobedience. Are there individuals and organizations of bad faith connected to that movement? Absolutely. All right. I think there are anti-Semites located in that movement. But we gotta be, this is critical, Yossi, and I feel this very strongly as an American Jew. The response to BDS as a movement, can't be so out of proportion that we wind up doing counterproductive things to the very things that make us thrive as American Jews. When American Jews get on board with shutting down free speech laws in order to prevent BDS coming in place, you're cutting off your whatever to despite your whatever. You're actually undermining what has made America a thriving place for Jews, which is free speech in the public square.
Okay, let's take it a step back. Before we get to the conversation about how to fight this, what the most effective or ineffective way to fight this is, let's look at the phenomenon of BDS itself. Doesn't it trouble you that the only international movement advocating the boycott of a country is aimed at the Jewish state?
Yes.
Say more?
Of course it does. That's why I don't support the movement. That's why I oppose it. I also agree with you that there are ways in which the rise of this movement relative to all sorts of other international crises, it doesn't smell right. Here's where I sit as a Zionist in relationship to the story. We have this weird thing as part of Jewish people and as part of Zionism, where we want to be exceptional and we want to be normal at the same time. Here, Israel has this ambivalent relationship to the West. It wants to be of the West, right, in some ways, but it doesn't want to be held accountable of the West in other ways. I think the occupation presents a unique problem in the West. Mm-hmm. It also has to do in part with the eyes of the world are focused on this story as a morality play. Mm-hmm. This has been the case since the dawn of time. This is the cradle of civilization. It happens here. So I think part of the fixation on this story has to do with a whiff of anti-Semitism, the obsession with this, and part of this has to do with the fact that human civilization and the relationship to the West are complicated, and we even have our own ambivalent relationship to whether we want to be different than the family of nations or belong to the family of nations.
I think that's a really important point that many Israelis often overlook, but there's an equally important point that many American Jews overlook, which is that this is not just a story of occupation, it's also a story of Israel finding itself in the anomalous situation, the unique situation of being the only country in the world that lives under a permanent death threat issued by many of its neighbors. We are the only country in the world for whom existence, the right to exist, is an issue. Now, think of how that plays on the Jewish psyche, that 70 years after the Holocaust, we are the only people on the planet that needs to defend our legitimacy, our right to exist. For me, as an Israeli, it drives me mad. And so when I look for a real conversation with American Jews, I'm also looking for an emotional partner here. I'm with you on the occupation, and I'm with you on exactly that point that we can't have it both ways. We can't be part of the club of the West, of democratic nations, and be the only democratic country that's a long-term occupier. But I need you as a partner in the conversation that says, well, we also can't tolerate a situation where it's the only country in the world whose legitimacy is under question is the Jewish state.
So this is something I've learned from you really over the years, which is the ways in which Israelis look to world Jewry not to falsify your fears. I get that. I really have learned from it, and I have changed my approach oftentimes to things that are in the news about what happened in Israel, how's the story playing out, to first try to listen to the voices of how Israelis are responding before I come to my own conclusions and before I act as a referee. This decision was right, this decision was disproportionate. I still sometimes may not agree with my Israeli friends' diagnosis of their reality, and oftentimes I identify with minority voices in Israel who say, you know, even in something like the Iran deal, there were minority voices in Israel who were actually in support of the deal.
Very minority.
But you have taught me, and I've learned from it, to listen to the fears of the Jewish people and to not falsify them. I guess by the same logic, what you're asking for is empathy and to some degree a generosity of spirit in responding to not only our threats, but to each other. Part of the reason I want to make sure that we don't take major groups of people and collapse them into being haters of the Jewish people is in some ways part of the same logic. I don't want to be in the business of walking around the world in this unbelievable condition that the Jewish people are in, deciding that anyone who gives off a whiff of some politics we don't like is anti-Zionist and therefore anti-Semitic, and I'm watching the way that it's happening. I think what you're trying to ask me and pushing towards, and I'm trying to formulate, is I'm interested in a conversation not of is anti-Zionism or is BDS anti-Semitic. I'm interested in a conversation of when is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic, when does BDS cross over, and I want The reciprocality that I want from Israelis is to listen to us saying, we're trying to hold a line as American Jews in our support for Israel, our criticism of Israel. We're also trying to hold relationships in coalitions with other people who have more ambivalent relationships to Israel. But when we are forced to paint with too thick of a brush in broad strokes of anyone out there who it sounds bad, that we have to treat them as being our enemies, it puts us, I think, all of us in an untenable position.
So I said we jumped right in and we ended kind of in the middle. And I know for anyone who's interested, we can share the full clip and you can watch more of this conversation. But there's plenty already here. So, Jim, thoughts?
I just want to say thank you for bringing this clip to all of our viewers and to us. I'm just going to put all my cards on the table. I love Yossi Klein Halevi and Yehuda Kurtzer. They're both, as Rabbi Rose said, just, text people for me, as I know for all of us. This particular clip just reinforces for me just how powerful and insightful and wise Yehuda Kurtzer is. And I found myself repeatedly shaking my head as he makes his cogent and articulate and brilliant comments. Rory, we've laughed about this before. When Yehuda teaches, I find myself taking notes so quickly and voluminously because he speaks such powerful wisdom. And what he just said, so much of what he just said, I was taking notes again, resonates for me and reinforces, and frankly, I'll just admit it, justifies for me the positions that I hold dear vis-a-vis BDS and vis-a-vis criticism of Zionism and the legitimacy of them and the dangers of the Jewish community allowing ourselves to practice what we fear most, which is the squelching of legitimate disagreement and civil discourse. So those are my quick reactions. I could say much more, but I want to, allow all of us to react.
Daniel?
I was really struck by, I think it was Yehuda who said this. I said someone asked which one was Yehuda. Yehuda has less hair than Yossi. I was struck by the way that the anti-BDS movement, Yehuda said it almost as a toss-away line here, but that the anti-BDS movement in combination with the BDS movement ends up constricting the space for American Jews to operate in. And I was really struck. I kept thinking from that, the ways that the BDS movement for American Jewish organizations has turned into a really important motivator for engagement and for fundraising. I think much the way that Yehuda talked about the anti-Semitism industry, similarly, the anti-BDS industry has also turned into a bit of an industry that beyond narrowing the space for American Jews to speak and to act and to et cetera, it also has turned into an important engagement and fundraising tool for so many American Jewish orgs. I also think back to testifying in Jeff City I'm in Jeff City right now, I'm in Senator Shoup's office, but to testifying against the anti-BDS bill. I testified for J Street in a letter that was signed by the whole executive committee to include you here, Jim. And I don't think I've ever said words to a room that so managed, Rory, I think you were in that room, that so managed to make everyone in the room upset. The Palestinians got really, really mad at me. The Jews got mad at me. It was impressive.
It's like being in my shul and I give a sermon every Shabbos.
It's what it felt like. Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to borrow a term that my teacher and friend Rabbi Bennett always used. Yes, and. Because I could say yes to the things that already have been said, but I want to add a couple of ands. A number of years ago, there was a debate about changing the name of the conservative movement. And all kinds of ideas came up. One group wanted to go to Masorti, right, which sort of means conservative in Hebrew. Another group wanted to go to something like confusative Judaism, right? Like confusative Judaism. And I actually want to, complexitive Judaism, whatever you want to, maybe better than confusative Judaism. But I wanted to go to nuanceative Judaism. I would actually like to start a movement in Judaism that has nothing to do with people's religious practice and everything to do with their orientation to the world, called nuanceative Judaism. And what I think is that here in this conversation, we heard nuance on both sides. Did I resonate a little bit more with one over the other? I did. And I'm sure we could each, kind of lay out how we felt about that. And I heard some of that already. But I loved the fact that each of them was trying to nuance the point. So that's another really important piece to add to this conversation. The other part of all of this is something that I think we all know, we all realize, we've all studied, it's been said over and over again in our sessions, but maybe not strongly enough. I think there are two profound Judaisms that are growing up side by side, and that's the Judaism of the land of Israel and the Judaism of the diaspora, particularly the North American diaspora. And I think those Judaisms are in some ways on parallel tracks, and in other ways, completely divergent orientations. And in and around this particular issue, I find it to be so fascinating to see how these two groups are growing up in different ways. Now, by the way, both, I would say, of the speakers, in many ways, daven in the same shuls, right? They express many of the same religious orientations and perspectives. They appreciate many of the beauties of Judaism that they share in common. Again, stylistically, maybe in some ways, I know one had hair and one didn't have hair, but in many, many ways, you could say that these people are in parallel tracks with one another. And yet, bring out this particular issue of Israel, and Yehuda was clearly a North American Jew, understanding one trajectory, and Yossi was, as much as he has had the experience of living outside the land of Israel, was very much an Israeli. And maybe the last piece is how dependent these conversations are on what your generation is. How close are you to the Shoah itself, right? Clearly, Yossi is closer to the devastation of the Shoah existentially, familially, than Yehuda is. And in another part of this clip, I think, or is in a different clip, right, Yehuda talks about the fact that he's been American for a very, very long time, okay? That's not Yossi's orientation, and how much even the specter of the Shoah plays into the consciousness. Some of it has to do with Israeli versus North American, but some of it has to do with generationally where we find ourselves. And I think that plays into much of what was already said. I'm going on a little bit long, but part of the whole machinery of anti-BDS, the whole notion of that anti-Israelism is anti-Semitism comes from that specter of the Shoah, living with that consciousness. And I don't want to, God forbid, say it's not a consciousness. It just might not be my consciousness, or it might not be the consciousness of the group that Yehuda Kurtzer in particular represents in this dialogue. I'll stop there.
Rabbi, I think that's very insightful, but I want to add to that and build on that. This argument, I think, is much more significant and relevant, not to the generation who has that Shoah memory and focus, but especially for the younger generations for whom the Shoah memory is non-existent at best, perhaps something they've learned or studied or been told, but who are struggling mightily. And if the Jewish, one of the things that to me really screams about this is exactly what you're speaking about Yossi's very Israeli approach to and mentality about, and Yehuda's North American awareness. This struggle is much more real, I believe, for us in North America. And I thought it was interesting that Yossi started out in the clip we watched arguing that the BDS argument, the debate around BDS, is a threat to us in the diaspora, I want to be a little provocative and say I disagree with him antithetically. I think that allowing the BDS conversation to exist and to not vilify Jews who, like myself, look, I'm like Yehuda, I don't like BDS, but I do not think that we do anybody a favor when we silence or accuse, or when we expand the accusations against BDS to allow anybody who's critical of Israel to be termed as an anti-Semite. And I think we will win this struggle or this debate or whatever it is much more effectively by allowing, and I want to make this tangible. We need to find ways, and I think Julia Mendelo typed this in the chat. We need to be working actively, and I'm trying to do this, to give the younger generation, people in high school, people in college, millennials, young adults, the language and the space and the safe space to talk honestly about this and not to silence them. And the older generation, as you said, our generation and the Shoah-aware generation is trying to silence it. And we're seeing that in the United States, in the governmental actions that are being taken, included in our own state, to try and shut down BDS. But we also see it within Jewish community. Quite frankly, the recent struggle that an organization like J Street, which is not even a BDS organization, J Street opposes BDS, but the effort that was attempted in this community to silence the voice of people who bring different Zionisms and different feelings about Zionism to the forefront. We need to be teaching our kids, encouraging our kids to have those conversations. We need to be providing them resources. It's why I'm teaching right now about Daniel Sokach's book, Can We Talk About Israel? Because there are no honest, legitimate conversations being sponsored by the Jewish community writ large today that allow this conversation to take place. Exactly, great book. It's a great primer, but we need to be working on expanding this conversation and not vilifying it. BDS is not a threat to us. We are a threat to ourselves. And I think that's what Yehuda said so beautifully in this clip. Sorry to be pontificating as usual.
That's what we're here for. So I'm so eager to jump into this because I love this conversation. And honestly, not only do I love the topic of this conversation, I deeply love this space. And I love being in this space with all of you, partially because that's actually what I think we're trying to do here, right? Like, this space doesn't exist in many places in our Jewish community, not just in St. Louis, but I think across the North American community. And I think about all of the things that had to go into creating this space, including the fact that, like, some of you here are senior rabbis at very large congregations, right? Like, the amount of, like, social capital and gravitas, all the things that have to go into being able to say these things, right? Or what is it like, I can't just say it alone, but to be surrounded by all of you, right? Like, all of us having each other's back on this for exactly this reason. And the part of this clip, and actually the reason why, when we had this conversation before we met to kind of talk about what we wanted to talk about, and what made me think of this conversation is actually, and I find it so poignant, it's like a simple line, but it just gets me right at the heart, is when when Yehuda says, I want more space. Like, he says it, and to me it was like something being like released from this burden on my chest, and suddenly I was able to breathe, right? Because that's what I'm hearing us all talking about. It's that that there has been such an effort to constrict this conversation. And I feel it, right? I physically feel it. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why, when somebody first approached me about the JCRC job, I remember the first thing I said, I don't want that. I don't want to talk about Israel, and I don't want to fundraise. Like, those sound like the two most miserable things I'd have to do. And I don't know why I then pursued, like, I can't tell you what happened between then and now that here I am. But it was, part of it honestly was that I went to the search committee, and they had me do like a presentation, and I spoke about Israel, and I just said, like, I'm just going to talk openly, and if they don't give me the job, then this isn't the place for me. And I don't even think it was so radical, but it was just this idea that there's these efforts to kind of preemptively shut down the conversation, for you to know that if you do say something, you're going to face such backlash on it. And I think also, like Julia, to your point about, kids who don't want to talk about this or engage with this on college campuses, I think part of it, people don't feel equipped to do it. They're not equipped to then have the fight about it, right? Like we're in anything else on college campuses, right? You can kind of dip your toe. I want to try philosophy and see how it feels, and I'm going to try this major, and maybe it's not where I end up, and I can explore my identity in a variety of ways. And we're so good. I think the Jewish community has been great. You want to suddenly, you're not sure if you won't even want to be Jewish anymore. You want to try this Jewish practice. Like we have a mechanism. We're going to be here whenever you want to come back. You're not sure you want to be Jewish? That's fine. Call us in 5 years. We'll still welcome you back in, like at any time, right? Like we are great at that. And if you even say, like, I think maybe Israel's being immoral, like you can get, like that could be enough to get entire social media campaigns against you, right? Like, and that's what I mean. Like when Yehuda says, like, we need space, like that's what resonates with me. And I just want to go back, Jim, like also to what you're saying, right? In terms of like college students, younger generation, I agree. And also, I don't think this is any, I don't think this is purely generational, right? Like, I think this exists like across generations. And I think that this, yeah, and then some people are saying like this we're sort of the opposite. I think exactly. I think when it comes to this topic, like there is not space. And I think education is one piece, but I hear that a lot. I hear people saying like, we need to educate our college students. We need to educate our college students. But I don't think that creates more space either, right? Like, I think we need to help people access information, certainly. But I think we need to let people find out who they are for themselves. Like, this isn't about us training them to say, here's the one right answer, or like, let me give you a timeline of 1948 to today, or 1917, or what year you start the story is already going to be political, right? Of how we go about doing it. But I think it's not, it's like how do we give people the tools, but then let them find themselves in the story? Because the last piece that I want to say in this is that I think this idea that like we sort of tell people they have to care about Israel, I think that's a hard, you can't tell people they have to care about something. They need to find themselves in the story, because if they're not in the story, then there's no reason that they care about it. And if we lecture at them, then they're not part of the story.
Really appreciate that, Rory. I'm struck that we ask American Jews, we actually, I think we sometimes demand that American Jews have a proxy identity of Israel, right? And it's a proxy identity because it's not actually our identity, and yet, right, it becomes a part of our identity, and that sort of defensive-ness there.
Daniel, sorry, should I just ask you about that, because it's really a specific point. Do you think it's a proxy identity, or is it possible that for a certain generation, again, I want to go to this generational thing, because when I think about some of the leaders in our community in particular, right, Rabbi Lipnik Zichrono Livracha used to always talk about people whose religion was Israel. He, by the way, warned them that this was a very dangerous reality, but he saw that that was their true religion. And so is it really a proxy identity, or is it an identity that works for some and not for all? And if we make it the necessary identity for connection, affiliation, legitimacy within the Jewish community, are we not making space, as Rory, pointed to already? And of course, was so, I think, so smart a comment. By the way, do you remember in the Nevi'im where it says, Harchivi mekom ohalech? Make your tent bigger. You know when that happens? That happens not at a time of plenty, not at a time of goodness. You expand the tent exactly when you're in crisis, because it's an indicator that you're not fearful, but rather open on all sides to the question. So I just want to make sure to ask you that question, Dan. It was a long way to get there, but do you think it's possible that it is really not a proxy identity, but it is, and I don't really know exactly what you mean by proxy identity. Maybe you could define that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said, first of all, Carney, just to start there. I'm borrowing the term proxy identity from Yehuda, who's the first person I heard use it in this context. I think the understanding of proxy identity is that I am not living in Israel and impacted as an Israeli. And even if I am an Israeli citizen, or some of us are Israeli citizens living in the United States, it still becomes, right, it's a distance. It becomes that connection to the state is in some ways a proxy identity rather than a primary identity. It's not directly impacted, as I think what Yehuda is using that term for. But the second piece of what I was going to say there is, I think what ends up happening is because of this, because we demand that, we often also send a generation of kids, or every year we send a crop of kids off to colleges and expect them to be apologists for this proxy identity, right? I mean, apologist in the sort of value neutral sense of that word. But right, I wonder if part of the question that we should be wrestling with as sort of American Jewish institutional leadership is this whole setup reasonable at all, right? Like, rather than talking about, did we give them enough Israel education for college? It's problematic that those are the questions that these students, these kids, these young people are being forced to reckon with, period. Not that it's escapable, and not that, right, but I do think backing away from this and taking a look at the dynamics of what we are asking of 18-year-olds, we being the Jewish institutional community, I mean, I think it's deeply problematic.
Yeah, I think it'd be worthwhile for us to just take a look at Galia's comment here, and a couple of others about this notion of, and in some ways related, Danny, to what you just said, Rabbi. It's the notion of, we're the people with education. We have information. The average young person doesn't have that information, doesn't have the wherewithal, doesn't have the confidence, right? And so therefore, we need to give them sort of a standard, party line on Israel, right? And then they can nuance it later on, right? But I got to tell you, I think that does no good for us, because unlearning information, having to back away from something that they heard when they were younger is very difficult. In fact, we can all point to young people who we've really lost to engagement in the Jewish communal life, let alone in Israel, okay? But in Jewish communal life, because they heard a lot of bubamaises, right? Which led them in a certain direction, made them believe certain kinds of things. And now coming home is really hard for them. And in part, I'm complicit in that in some ways. Giving simple answers to complex problems, right? I don't mean age appropriate, okay? Because that's true. There are age appropriate things to say. But when your kid is already 16, 17, 18, 20 years old, they're already thinking in profound ways, complex ways. And to simply give them pablum is not the solution here, because bringing them home after that is very hard, at least in my experience.
Well, al achat kama v'kama, all the more so, Rabbi, when we are talking about Israel in the age of social media. I mean, we can't put this genie back in the bottle. The reality is that all of the truth and the falsehood about Israel and Zionism and the Palestinians is out there. And so I cannot agree with you more that we have to speak honestly, even painfully. And the Jewish community, the pro-Zionism establishment has got to let go of the hasbara, the propaganda, which pervades and has pervaded for a very, very long time the Israel establishment. And I'm not only talking about the blatant hasbara, the blatant propaganda, those emails we all get all the time that people love to forward from person to person that talk about, look at all the amazing things the Jews and the Jewish state in Israel have done, or the startup nation mentality and all that. And that we forward on proudly, and they always end by saying, and what has the Arab world done? Which I find disgraceful and embarrassing. But it's not just that, it's the subtle ways history has been written, and the textbooks that we've given the kids, and the trips to Israel that we've brought children and adults on for generations, have not told a genuinely honest story. You're right, everything's got to be age appropriate and situational, but we have got to be unafraid of just trying as hard as we can to tell the truth, because that's what we're being held accountable for. That's what the young people who are intrigued by or curious about BDS or Jewish Voices for Peace or any of the numerous groups that are perhaps beyond the pale as far as we're concerned in terms of what they're actually saying. But that's why that's so intriguing, because they say, wait a minute, tell me the whole story, be honest with me. And as I've tried to teach more and more, I'll use one example. As I've tried to teach in the last few years about what I believe, what I've tried to learn is the most honest, truthful story of the founding of the modern state of Israel, and not only what the pioneers and the early settlers in Israel and the army and did in the War of Independence, the build up to and through and past, but I've also tried to teach the truth about what we did to the native Arabs and the Palestinians living on that land at the time. And people are always amazed. I didn't even know they were there. Daniel Sokach calls in his book, he has a chapter that's entitled, "What? There were people living here?" I mean, when we teach, when we actually have people look at us and say that, and when we tell them the truth, which is there's some shameful truth. And a few courageous Israelis have been willing to deal with that truth, but the propaganda industry won't. It whitewashes it and wipes it away, and we have to teach the whole truth.
Absolutely.
Nothing but the truth. So help me God.
I want to make a comment, and then I want to pose a question. And the comment I'm just reflecting on in this conversation, and I'm thinking back, if the only things I talked about when I was in college were things that I was actually educated about, I never would have said any, like this number of stupid opinions that, in retrospect, right, or things that I might have even, right, but that's what college, that's what you're supposed to do, right, that's, if any, right, we're supposed to
it's only limited to college.
No, I'm just we're talking about college, but
I thought that was the theme of our meeting. Actually, was just practicing. Is that not? No.
No, which by the way, that's actually what Chavruta is also, right? I mean, that's it's I'm going to try this idea on for size. Let's play it out with me, right? And the number of times I formulate an idea because I try something only to reject it, right? But let me try it. Let's play it out. Let's see. Could God really be saying that God hates humanity? Maybe, right? Let's see where it goes. But my question is, and this, I really mean this as a question because I struggle with this, and I don't know that I have an answer, is why has this become what feels to me like the single greatest red line that we have in the community, right? Why? I mean, genuinely, I use this example before sort of flippantly, right? But I actually do mean it, right? If somebody came to us and said, I think I'm converting to Christianity, right? I think I would be devastated, right? I don't mean right, but there would absolutely be a path to come back, right? That I think we have these ways where we want to encourage people to learn for themselves, right? I'm going to give you this text and I'm going to study with you for your B'nai Mitzvah portion. And then if you come up with an interpretation that's totally different than where I end up with it, I'm going to let you get up on the pulpit. I'm going to let you say it anyway, because that's your Torah, even if it's in some ways antithetical to something that I believe in. Or, right, I think, people can disagree, but I feel that space. I feel that space in so many areas of our lives. And I think also to Yehuda's point, there is an industry, I do very much think that there is an industry that is invested in eliminating space here. And we could talk about tons of different reasons. I know why some people are invested in it. But I actually don't know, as a community, why we've allowed that space to be taken over. How come we can be the four of us with completely, I said this before, right? We had totally different interpretations of God, and we were all able to talk about it, and none of us got kicked out of the community for saying that, and totally different interpretations of where Torah comes from, and none of us got kicked out of the community for it. And some of the things that we're saying here today, or the questions that we're asking, other people could lose their jobs for asking it.
Well, Lori, I wanted to say, I think, and again, humbly, that this is existential for people. And the problem is that each of us has what we would call existential when it comes to Judaism. Right? And I think that if you define yourself as, right, a Jew for Israel, a Jew for, if those are the definitions, then when you put a little chink in that armor, the whole thing potentially falls apart. It's like pulling out the wrong piece in Jenga.
So I want to just jump in, because then I really will stop and I'll let you. But I want to say that's what makes me sad, right? What makes me sad is that we've allowed you to take over the space that we're all supposed to be. And that doesn't. I love Israel, right? I think I hope we've established, right? But that we're not Jews for God, and we're not Jews for Torah, right? Those aren't chinks in the armor. I think there's something really tragic in that.
Roy, but there are places in the world, this also makes me just as sad, by the way, where Jews for mikveh, Jews for kashrut, Jews for Shabbos, many of those things would create that uproar, just not with American Jewry in the way in which this one does, because I think at a moment in time, just to go back, and now I'll borrow Rabbi Daniel's comment, it became a proxy identity, and it should never have been allowed to be that. We cannot be one-horse wonders in Judaism ever. Judaism is a gestalt. It's greater than the sum total of its parts. And you just can't be a one act. It has to be a multi-act reality. So that's the first piece. The second piece I wanted to add is there's got to be a way to be proud without being a triumphalist. And I think that's the key part, at least for me, and I think for all of us in this conversation. Making space doesn't mean you give up who you are. Many of us will disagree about the nuances of this particular conversation, right? I want to say I love Israel, and many, many, many times, and I know all of us would agree, I am very proud of Israel. I want the good news that comes from Israel. When I hear about good news from Israel, it makes me smile. I look for those articles, right? And I share them with community. But equally so, when Israel missteps, I want to feel that I live in a time and a place, particularly as a diaspora Jew and a leader of diaspora Jew, because I love Israel, to point out, to raise it up, to underline it and say, here's an area where the Jewish state, our homeland, can improve. And I feel it my obligation and responsibility, because I'm connected umbilically to that place, to say we need to get better. That's a difference between, pride, I think, honest pride, and triumphalism that doesn't allow you the space to even look at yourself sufficiently. And again, I think the anxiety, right, and the fear of another Shoah and anti-Semitism, and to just scratch anybody who's anti-Israel and is an anti-Semite and is looking to destroy us, even within our own community, leads us to that place. And I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this in a way that will be helpful to us all. Be proud, be strong, have strong opinions and ideas. But don't allow those ideas to become, like they're not Torah, they're not gospel.
I want to, if I could just add a quick thought about this, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately as I'm doing a lot of teaching about Israel and Zionism. I think what you just sort of laid the foundation of is, it's ironic, what is new, what is old becomes new again. When you read and study the Zionism of Echad Ha'am, the vision of a cultural Zionism that emanates out from Israel to the rest of the world, and especially to the diaspora, but even to the non-Jewish world around, I think Echad Ha'am actually created a context for us to talk about this very idea that it's one thing to be proud of Israel when Israel is good. It's another thing to expect Israel to strive always to be even better, precisely because that makes the whole world better. That was the vision of this concept of a Zionism. If Zionism is only for, and I fear, especially in this era right now, when we are so, once again, hyper-focused as a Jewish community on how victimized we think we are, how vulnerable we believe we might be, how we are convinced, and we are convincing ourselves that anti-Semitism is becoming this explosive force that is threatening us. A conversation for another webinar, perhaps, but especially now, if we allow Israel as survival, if we allow Zionism as survival to be the be-all and end-all of our Zionism, then we do a great disservice to the vision of what Israel can be. When Israel is looked to by the whole world, in the years when Israel was looked to by the whole world as a symbolic exemplar of what a nation could be, Israel was powerful and dramatically shaping the world. And we have allowed, by our complicity, by our silence, by our acquiescence, Israel to just be another country fighting for its survival. And, if that's all Israel is, it's hard for young people to jump on that bandwagon. They say, why? I don't need to defend that enterprise. Help me to understand why I should fall in love with Israel the way we all did. And I'm very intrigued by a return, like we need a rebirth of Echad Ha'am Zionism taught anew for a new world. I'm just playing.
I don't disagree. I just want to maybe nuance it for myself, at least, so I can feel like I'm being integrous in this conversation as well. There are many, many, many days, and maybe you'd agree with me, Rabbi Bennett, that I do. I really take great pride in the exceptionalism of Israel. I still believe in the dream. I think we all do. I just want to make sure that we articulate it. There are maybe less moments than there used to be. Maybe it's frustrating because of those areas that are the scars, the gashes, the blemishes are just so profound sometimes. But on the other hand, there are many, many, many days, right, that I really feel that. And I believe in it. And that's why it's an enterprise that I support with my entire being, up to and including trying to, whatever I can do, far away, a small little rabbi, in a third city in America, trying to make a difference, right? But I do believe that there is still that exceptionalism that's there. And again, I think Yehuda laid it out in such an interesting way, right? We want to still be exceptional. We want to believe in Jewish exceptionalism. We want to believe in Zionist exceptionalism. But on the other hand, we want to just be, sort of like everybody else. It's hard to dance at those two dances simultaneously.
I want to jump off of what you're saying there, Carney, because it strikes me that actually there are two big poles of American Jewish identity often. One is Israeli exceptionalism, or Israeli proxy identity, or whatever kind of language we're using there, right? And the other is American exceptionalism. And I think we're living at a moment, I think part of the tension that we're seeing right now is that we're living in a moment when both of these poles of Jewish identity, American Jewish identity, I really want to hold on to that because I genuinely believe it. It's one of the great chidushes of American Jewry that we turn democracy into a Jewish value, into a central Jewish value. And I think when we look at a world where, first of all, it feels like these two are increasingly in tension, but also in a world where Israeli exceptionalism and democratic exceptionalism or American exceptionalism both feel, at least morally, in decline, that's a lot of the background of what's happening here, and a lot of the tension and a lot of the sociology of these sorts of things. And I think it's why we respond as individuals so strongly to these things, because we've integrated them as a part of ourselves. And so it's not that criticism of Israel feels like criticism of Israel. It feels like criticism of Israel. It feels like criticism of my mom. Right? No, I mean, really. And I think that's why we respond this way. And I think both as individuals and as institutions.
And we know your mom, and she's a really nice person.
Exactly. I don't understand why Rory keeps saying those things about my mother. Exactly.
All we say is it skips a generation. That's what we say.
Exactly. Rory didn't want my mom on the JCRC council. I don't know what it was.
I just want you to know that my mom is texting me, telling me that she really liked the person talking. And I don't know if she still thinks that anymore.
My apologies, Mrs. Picker.
So, there's this comment that's I've seen a couple of times already going through about that, on the one hand, we want to be like everybody else, but we're not treated like everybody else. I want to say that I'm really good with that. I'm really good with the fact that we're not treated like everybody else. You know why? I don't want to be everybody else. I don't want to be a C+. I don't want to be average. I never shot for that. I think we should be shooting for exceptionalism in all aspects of our lives. And I think that's what our religious tradition is trying to say to us. We want to be more menschlich, want to be more human, more kind, more considerate, more generous, more open, more sensitive. That's, I think, what Judaism is trying to say to us. That, by the way, is the Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah. That's what I think the land of Israel, the state of Israel, the enterprise of Israel is really all about. And that requires struggling. That requires mid-course corrections and modifications along the way when we fall over in one direction or the other. And that's what the halakha is, right? It's a way to live one's life on a pathway that leads oneself to an elevated status, right? Not because we're looking to be triumphalist, but rather because we're proud. We're proud of aspiring and questing to be a little bit better tomorrow than we are today. And to have that expectation of our birthplace, right? That, the tabur haaretz, the belly button of the universe from which we are sustained, Israel is not a crazy concept. In fact, it is the concept that I think we should be trying to share with the entire world. If we could say to everybody, we live a certain kind of way, right? And we find meaning and consequence, and it brings goodness into the world. Don't be us, but follow us in your way to try to make the world that kind of place. I find that to be very exciting as a message to the world at large, regardless of whether we're living in the diaspora or whether we're living in Israel. We'll do it in different kinds of ways, but it's still the main goal. That's what I think is the common thread.
It's beautifully said, and to not be ashamed or afraid to hold ourselves to the highest possible standard. I love what you said, about striving for exceptionalism. Look, Daniel, you're right. Neither America nor Israel is particularly exceptional today, but we have the potential of exceptionalism, and we should strive we should try to be exceptional. And speaking of our mothers, my mother of blessed memory, I'll never forget her as I was growing up. Whenever she would, on those rare occasions when I would need to be disciplined and reminded of something that I had done that was not good, my mother used to say, when I'd try and wriggle out of it by saying, well, everybody else is doing it too, my mother would always say, I'm not talking to everyone else. I'm talking to you. And I'm sure many of us have heard similar teachings. I get really troubled when our defense of Israel's shortcomings or of Israel's moral deficits or of Israel's mistakes, just pure mistakes, when our defense is, why is everybody being critical of Israel when they're not critical of everybody else? My answer is, I'm not talking about everybody else. I'm talking about Israel. And, we just witnessed this the last couple of weeks when in this atrocious report about apartheid, Israel was accused of something that we all know is not accurate or true. But the defense of that should not be, don't accuse us of something that you don't accuse the rest of the world of. That's the same kind of nonsense. The response should be, let's talk about accuracy. Some of the behaviors of Israel are dangerously close to apartheid behavior, but Israel is not an apartheid nation. And so let's talk with truth about where Israel can strive to be better and how Israel can strive to be better. And if Amnesty International wants to write off Israel with one fell swoop, we should respond to that strongly and vehemently, but we shouldn't do it in a defensive way that says, they're doing it too. Why aren't you criticizing them? That's childish. And, our mothers taught us well. We should listen to what they've taught us.
Carney, you talked earlier about names, and I can't help in thinking about this conversation actually to think like, I love the name Israel, right? Just, the people of Israel, the children of Israel. I was actually just talking about this with somebody. Right? Like we get named in the story of Jacob wrestling with the man, with the angel, right? And he says at the end, he said, the angel says, I have to go. And Jacob says, bless me. And the angel says, right, like, what's your name? And you're no longer going to be called Jacob. You're going to be called Israel because you wrestled with man and with God and you triumphed. And I always think back, I remember being a kid and being at a weekend retreat, a Shabbaton, and the rabbi, like, he gave this Dvar Torah on it. He said, like, what's this name Israel, right? Like, you wrestle, right? Israel comes from the root of wrestling. He says, like, name us for triumph. Like, that's a much cooler name, right? But it stayed with me forever because I think, like, that's what I'm hearing also in this, right? Like, it's the struggle itself is the journey, right? Like, that is the goal. And I'm so grateful to be able to struggle with all of you. And that to me maybe comes back also to the space, right? Like, you need room to struggle. It's not about right, Jim, you were talking about like teaching truth, and I appreciated that. And I also was thinking to myself, like, you had to go on a journey to get there, right? Like, the journey was actually, from my experience talking to you, I shouldn't put words into your mouth, right? But like, that was a profound journey for you. And it's not going to be the same if you just go and tell everyone, let me tell you all the answers, right? Like, they're not going to end up in the same place you are, right? Like, we all need the journey. We need the struggle. And I want to embrace that. And my challenge for everyone, like part of for me, what it is to have everyone here who's listening is that like we all need to be part of the process of challenging simple answers, of challenging the broad brushstrokes. And I even appreciate in the chat, and some of us have also been responding, right? But like Dan, you've been pushing back on us also with some of this, right? Like, and do like, I don't think any of us should accept simple answers to hard questions. And I believe firmly, because I know when I've been challenged, that's when I hone my ideas better. It's when I understand things better. But we need the community to do that, because I think all too often it's comfortable for us to get simple answers, right? Like it's very easy. Even, Jim, we can use the example of the Amnesty report. We can use any example, but right, it's very easy to just put out one statement that says, this is heinous, and then we file it away in a drawer and we all feel good about ourselves. And that's moral posturing, but it doesn't actually move anything forward. If there's a problem, we need to respond to it. If we're doing something right, like let's work on it. But the challenge that I find of working in a community where I don't always feel like I have space, and again, I don't mean St. Louis, but I mean like the Jewish communal world broadly, the problem is that it's very easy for all of us to accept that as the norm. And I want to be very, very specific. I don't just mean all of us. I mean, like, right, if you're a part of the community and people have said, like, it's normative to reject J Street. It's normative to call for your rabbi to be fired if they said this in a sermon. It's normative, right? Like, this is what we do as a community. If we're not struggling or challenging with that, then we're all part of what we're talking about of constraining the discourse and constraining the dialogue. Like every one of us needs to be part of the process of demanding struggle and wrestling. And if there's something you don't like, let's push back on it. Let's engage with it. I hope all of us have made clear that we want to engage on it. But that's not just something, and I know I've done this before in other spaces of this conversation, but I want to be really clear. Like I think what we're doing here is trying to create this space and is opening it up. And I hope that in creating space, we're inviting other people into that space. But we can only hold this space if the community continues to support it. If all of you who are listening are not part of the process of insisting that this is what you want to see, then we're all part of the problem of shutting it down. And so, yes, like we can start this conversation, but again, like we can start this conversation and any one of us can get called into our boards and get threatened with firing if we continue this conversation and never have this conversation again, right? Like space is something that all of us need to be continuing to build. And for me, I keep coming back to like that we are the people who wrestle. Like we are the people who wrestle, and it's not about whether we win or lose. It's about the wrestling. And I want to embrace that as our name and our moral call in this world.
I told my board that if they fire me for this, then I'm going to go work for Rabbi Bennett. So it's going to be just fine. It's all going to work out okay. But
and now Rabbi Bennett's board is invested in you staying in your job.
In fact, they're going to contribute towards it. It's very good. Rabbi Bennett himself. I just want to add one more thing, Rory, to what you said so beautifully and really passionately, and I really appreciate that. But I want to add one more thing, at least from my perspective. This is the way Jews do Torah. This is the way Jews do life. This is called being a bar plukta. This is called being a combatant for the sake of refining the argument and the discussion. We're not in this to win it with sort of these platitudes and these blanket statements, you're in or you're out. That's never the way that we studied Torah. That's never the way we created the Judaism that we had. I was just looking at a sefer called the Or Zarua, and the Or Zarua talks about all of the visitations to different places in Eastern Europe that he visited and talked about this is parenthetically word crazy, right? Very different minhagim, right? The ways in which people conducted and comported themselves in those communities. But there was never a comment like, and those people are crazy for doing that. And those people don't love God. Those people aren't observing Torah. Those people don't love the Jewish people. In fact, he walks away saying what? Wow, what a beautiful rainbow. What a plethora of possibilities. Right? Nobody's like us. We are so diverse. We are so out there in so many different kind of ways. That's what we need in our community. And to say that if one disagrees on Israel, now one has no place within the community, that's chutzpah beyond any kind of chutzpah that I think we've ever seen. And it's so not Jewish. We are laminating onto ourselves orientations to the world that have nothing to do with where we come from. Ours is a culture of machloket, right? of argumentation for the sake of heaven always. So if we don't go back to that and allow for that within our community, I think we're doing a disservice to the tradition that each of us is trying to teach in our communities.
That was really powerful. Thank you, Rory and Carney. I absolutely agree. I think it's essential for our Jewish community and for our health as a Jewish community. I know we only have a couple minutes left. I wanted to raise up one point that we haven't talked about from the video, which was Yossi, and I've heard Yossi talk about this. I've had conversations with Yossi about this, that he hasn't felt like American Jews have taken Israeli existential threats seriously enough at times, particularly with the Iran crisis. I know for Yossi, that was a real moment for him in his relationship with American Jewry. But I really loved how Yehuda articulated this, right? Like that one of our obligations is to take each other's fears seriously. And I don't know, I'd be really interested with these last couple of minutes to hear if any of y'all find that experience. I know, for instance, like I sit in the United States and I never, including today, I have never had someone explain to me in a way that was satisfying how opposing the Iran deal made Israel even an iota safer. I never understood. It made no sense to me. Even a little bit continues to make no logical sense to me. And yet, let me tell you, like I get on that airplane and I arrive in Ben Gurion, and all of a sudden the Iran threat feels real in a way that it doesn't sitting over here reading the same newspapers, right? Like, and yet,
Daniel, I want to go in your direction. I just want to add just one piece that I found interesting that I don't know if anyone else caught. Did you notice that Yehuda was more concerned about Israeli Jewry, right? The neshama of Israeli Jewry, and Yossi was worried more about the neshama of American Jewry. I mean, I just think it's such an interesting juxtaposition, and for me, that's why I love them both. Because they're expressing the love that we should have for one another. It's like you're sitting in your house worried about people in Tel Aviv, right? And they're sitting in Tel Aviv and they're worrying about us. Like that makes us us. And for me, that's why this conversation has to continue to be expanded so that we don't lose that kesher, that connection that keeps us as one people. So I felt that had to get thrown into the conversation as well. And it was a great modeling for me of the way in which I want to interact with Israel.
It's also, you're absolutely right, Carney. It's also an argument for why we need to encourage all of our people here to develop such relationships with people in Israel so that we know people for whom we can worry and who will pick up the phone and worry for us. We've all experienced that. Our Israeli friends calling us when they hear news about St. Louis and are you okay? Are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. Are you okay? You know, you're absolutely right. That's powerful and important.
So, and I want to say, right, I think that's like the work that all of us are doing of like building relationships. And I want to give like a shout out because, and Daniel, I know you said you might, I don't know if you're hopping off like the second or you.
I have to leave and I have to
so
give Senator Super office back.
Right. Well, so, I mean, but Daniel, like you're in Jeff City right now and you're trying to just talk to people and tell stories so that people have that connection, right? Like this is, right, of like, what does it mean to defend trans kids? What does it mean to actually like look at people for whom these bills are impacting and hear their stories? I mean, Daniel and I, we were in the room last week in Jeff City when there was testimony about this, I'm just going to say, I think a really horrific gun bill. And, you know, the most powerful part of that was listening to two parents who had lost their son to gun violence talk about how this bill, how this culture already impacted them and how this bill, thanks Daniel, will wind up, but you know, right. And so yes, right, like we need to be doing this more. And I think that like we need to recognize all of the ways in which like all relationships start to become, right, like it's because Yossi and Yehuda do love each other, right? Like that's why they deeply care about one another. It's why, I mean, I think for all of us who are working to build relationships in St. Louis, not just with the Jewish community, but between the Jewish community and others, right? So people know who we are and feel like invested in the Jewish community as well. And also,
and they love the enterprise, That's the key.
And they do. And I think it should absolutely be part of it. And like, I think we have to recognize that. I think for a lot of people, they're not going to be interested, right? Like even that question of like, well, why build this relationship, right? Why should I build a relationship with someone in Israel as opposed to someone who lives 2 zip codes over here in St. Louis. And to me, it's all the above, right? Like it's how, right? What does it mean to be, right? And this is, I think, maybe like some of you who are talking about being part of the family of nations, being part of the world, right? Like, so for me, it's what does it mean to be in relationship with Jews in Israel? What does it mean to be in relationship with non-Jews here in St. Louis, right? Like, what does it mean, like, for all of us to exist in the world, and to be invested in other people because I'm intertwined with other people, right? Because like their life is impacting my life, and because we're all part of some bigger whole, right? Like that to me is the question that I hope is helping to guide us in this journey.
Absolutely. Beautiful.
Amen.
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 Amen. Amen. Amen. Wow. By the way, I was going to let Daniel know that we would all like to vote for 4 more years of Daniel in that office. I don't know if you would want to take up the. But is there anything in the chat that we feel we just want to maybe say a word or two about? Pick on one thing or one item. Is there anything? There's so many beautiful comments and powerful comments here. It's
I'm gonna lift up here. I think, we just got this from Lisa, who said we should work out a way to look critically with love at the processes in our congregational spaces. How are we encouraging, discouraging differences in our welcoming, orienting, teaching, examining our language, behaviors, policies, right? Like, yes, all of it, right? All of it.
This is right. This is Jewish Disabilities Awareness and Inclusion Month, right? Black History Month. I mean, there's so many things that are happening in and around this particular time of the year that point in that direction, right? That we need to be aware and open and not walking around with our eyes and ears closed as if the world out there, has nothing to say to us or nothing that we need to respond to.
Well, and I think applying the same principles we've been discussing today about applying to Israel, to our own institutions and to ourselves, to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards in our institutions, and to be willing to do it courageously and fearlessly, not be worried that we will bear our, what do people say, showing our dirty linen in public, but rather saying, let's talk openly about where we can be better, because I think that's what our faith tells us we should do, whether it comes to Zionism or whether it comes to our own individual personalities and lives.
And again, and one other piece that's said, I think being said in the chat here is that, it's easy for you guys because you've been having these conversations and you're well versed in many of these topics. And I just want to say back to everybody, don't wait for that to happen. Right. Starting the conversations doesn't necessarily mean, and Rory kind of alluded to it, when we were young, we didn't have so much information, we had opinions, right? There are often things that we intuit, that we feel that are worthy of a conversation. And we know that sometimes when we go out there on the limb, someone's going to whack us. If we could minimize the whacking, right, and open ourselves up to the possibility of listening and hearing, because very often it's not what they say, it's the anxiety behind what it is that they're saying. Why does somebody feel this way? What's the concern? Why did Yossi have the kind of anxiety he had in this conversation? Why, and I would say, why did Yehuda not have that anxiety? Or what anxieties does Yehuda have as a fully American Orthodox Jew? Like, what is he struggling with? And if we could maybe start to think that way, I think we open ourselves up to really having dialogue. There was a request to put the entire link, if we can.
So I will. So I just wanted to say, first, I wanted to echo everything that was said, and also just to you, Carney, yes, but actually, right, I don't know that any of us here actually feel like we're the experts in this, right? Like, I mean, and so
I think people think we are, and they're coming to us, but if we learned anything, we're trying to become a little bit more sensitive, a little more knowledgeable.
Right. And that's what I mean, like in terms of kind of waiting until we have that, right? I think, and that again goes back to, for me, like the theme of Chavruta, like it's that, like we wrestle with a text, like we wrestle with an idea and we try things on and we push and we encounter it with different people and then we see where it comes out. Not that we actually know all of the answers, right? We just know, I like to think we know how to ask better questions, not that we actually have better answers. So
the crossing of swords sharpens both swords,
Exactly. Well said. Well said. So I don't know if anyone has any other final, but I will be sending an email. So let me just say quickly that if you are watching this on YouTube or on Facebook and you're not here in the Zoom, that's wonderful. It just means that we don't actually have a way to track that you are here. If you registered and you got an email, I have your email address, so I can send an email with the link to the full conversation. It's about 27 minutes, and you'll find the clip in the middle of it. If you are listening somewhere else and you would like to be added to the mailing list or to get this link, then you can send me an email, and it's rpickerniece@jcrcstl.org. If you just Google my name, it's pretty easy to find me on the JCRC website. And I will send out the link to the full conversation between Yehuda and Yossi, which is really, really fabulous, and gets into some of, we reference, it talks about some of the basis for their anxieties or where they all come from, who they grew up with. And actually, I think it's from maybe 2019, because they start to get into some conversations about President Trump and also like the existential crisis in terms of not only, right, so it was America to Israel, but also Israelis in America and all of that type of stuff. So it's a great conversation, and happy to hear all of your thoughts about it. But for now, unless anyone else has any closing thoughts, I think we've kept everyone slightly longer than we usually try to. And I just want to thank everyone for helping us to create this space and to build more space in our community.
Thank you.
Well done. Good conclusion.